Yes, can see you now.
Okay, thank you and welcome and talofa everyone. We will start the webinar. This morning's webinar, as you all are familiar with, is hosted by the Pacific Climate Change Center based here at the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program. And this morning we are very privileged to have the Director General of SPREP joining us to provide the opening remarks. We welcome Director General Sefa. Also, we have our distinguished speakers for this morning, and I will introduce them very quickly before I ask our Director General to provide the opening remarks. Our first speaker for this morning is Dr. Mark Howden. He is the Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University and also an Honorary Professor at the Melbourne University. He has been a major contributor to the IPCC second, third, fourth assessment reports and also a lead author, and has been was awarded was awarded as part of the IPCC's the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with the authors and also Argo. Mark has been in a lot of different roles, has published over 330 publications, and has been working in innovative options and systems in agriculture and food security and natural resources, water and biodiversity, with over 27 years of experience working with farmers, industry groups, agribusiness, urban utilities, and various agencies in science and policy roles. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mark Howden. Our second speaker for the webinar this morning, ladies and gentlemen, is a young climate change champion. She's Isabella Mackenzie Dewa. She is from the Kiribati Island. She's an advisor to the Climate Change Office on Adaptation, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts in Environment Management. She's a member of the Executive Youth of Tongariro Youth Action in Kiribati, leading youth climate actions, and she's been working with you on innovative solutions and very passionate about responding to climate change risks in the community. She will be speaking as a youth representative. Also, this morning, ladies and gentlemen, we have the privilege of having Miss Anne Rasmussen. Miss Anne is no stranger to the region. She's the lead Pacific climate negotiator and chief spokesman for the Alliance of Small Island States in the UNFCCC negotiations. At COP28, she gained recognition as AOC's chief negotiator on calling out the loopholes in the agreement coming out of COP28. She holds a master's degree in climate change from Malta University. She's at the moment the lead negotiator for AOCIS. Also joining us this morning is Ms. Janine Felson. She's the ambassador and deputy permanent representative for the permanent mission of Belize to the United Nations. She's also no stranger to the climate change negotiation space. She's a distinguished diplomat and a scholar, and brings over 2 decades of multilateral experience. She's specialized in public law and climate finance. She also co-chairs the BBNG Preparatory Commission and heads the Indo-Pacific Climate Hub at Melbourne Futures at Melbourne University. She's the lead climate finance negotiator for AOCs as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, those are our distinguished speakers for this webinar. We will now ask the Director General of SPREP to provide us with the opening remarks. Thank you, DG.
and everyone online. Your Excellency, Ambassador Felsen, thank you for joining us late at night from New York. Your country hosts the 5Cs Center, and our center here strives to work closely with the 5Cs Center. Good to catch up with you again, Mark. Thank you for your continued leadership of IPCC, especially pushing issues from our region and seeking to facilitate participation from the Pacific region. And always good to see Anne last week after a long time away from Samoa. And it's also good to hear from the Kiribati representative. We had the Pacific Youth Dialogue on loss and damage here last week. It's a continuation of that vein, hearing from you on these two important issues. The goal of 1.5 to stay alive has always been a cornerstone and a key message that we in the Pacific take to COPs. And the goal is something that SPREP really fought hard to get into the Paris Agreement. We continue that advocacy to ensure that countries, especially our larger economies, work towards more ambitious emission targets and to meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement. The recent ruling by the ICJ is something that we hope will help us to all move towards meeting the 1.5 targets. The other key area that we always bring up as small island developing states at COP is the area of finance. So it's really good that we are able to hear from Ambassador Felsen. This is something that we always need to get engagement from our developed country partners to ensure that the targets for financing, not financing that is usually linked to financing for development, but financing that's really dedicated and focused on climate change actions, climate change or response to the impacts of climate change. The Pacific Climate Change Roundtable and the loss and damage dialogue that we had here last week was a constant vein throughout many of the discussions, irrespective of the thematic area that we discussed, was the crucial element that we need resources to be able to undertake the actions that's required. These actions are not something for the future. It's something that countries are experiencing right now. So discussing these two key issues together is really helpful in making the science marry with the policy and financing actions that are needed to ensure that we effectively address climate change. I think I'll leave it at that because I know the speakers are much more qualified than myself to speak on these issues, and I look forward to what our speakers will share with us to help us to improve how we engage and take action in our various roles and jurisdictions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director General Sefa. We will now go into to our speakers for the webinar, but by also way of introduction, I wanted to let you all know that we are hosting this webinar on the Pacific Climate Change Innovation Lounge. It is a platform that the Pacific Climate Change is establishing to enable such events, such as webinars, and we will launch that the launch at we're hoping to launch it at the Pacific Island Forum in Honiara. Also, for those of you who are joining us around the world, sorry, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Fred Patterson. I am the Climate Finance Readiness Advisor based here at SPREP at the Pacific Climate Change Center as well. And so we welcome all of you who are joining us. Before I hand it over to Professor Mark as well, I think within as the Director General has alluded to, the pathway towards 1.5 in terms of science, Mark Howden will touch on that, is becoming a challenge. And at the same time, for us, the Pacific SPREP and also AOSIS at the negotiations level, the NCQG provided some form of hope in terms of enabling financial resources to flow to address our adaptation needs. And one of the things that we were thinking about in designing this webinar is the pathway towards 1.5 rests somewhere else. And so I think the mitigation work program and the different initiatives for low carbon development is critical to that going into COP30. Whilst the Baku to Belém roadmap on climate finance provides pathways for adaptation, we cannot continue to adapt if our 1.5 degrees goal is not achieved. And I think that is the crunch of this webinar that our speakers will speak to. And finally, we will speak to the issue of special circumstance. The issue of special circumstance for seeds within the whole global discussions is an important area that we, the SPREP and AOSIS, would like to see it operationalized. What does that mean? What does operationalization of the special circumstance mean relative to our survival, which depends on 1.5, and the enabling finance for us to be able to adapt and respond to climate change? So I think this webinar is about bringing that together in anticipation on the discussions going forward towards COP30, but also in the Pacific, the forum leaders coming up in Honiara, as well as even within the global discussions going into COP30 and also COP31. So I think I will hand over to Mark, who will provide us with a short presentation on the trajectory in terms of keeping 1.5 alive. So Mark, it is our privilege to have you again. I will hand over to you now. Thank you, Professor Mark.
Talofa, good morning, and thank you, Fred, and thank you to the Director General for the introduction and for the opportunity to be here today. So just checking that you can hear me, Fred?
Yes, I can hear you clearly, Professor Mark.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Great. So I'll just start off the sort of presentation, and what I've got to deal with today is a lot of information in a short time. So we've got really only about 10 minutes to cover what's a very complex area, and I'll be covering some of the science about 1.5 degrees goal, the trajectories of change and potential impacts in the Pacific. And the particular things, the points I'll make is the latest findings that reinforce urgency for action. How does the current trajectory of emissions compare with a 1.5 degrees compatible pathway? How urgent is the change in emissions, and what some of the particular impacts that Pacific SPREP should be aware of? So I want to just focus in the first instance on greenhouse gas emissions, and what we're seeing in this graph from the Global Carbon Project is those emissions continue to rise. So last year was the record highest level of carbon dioxide emissions. This graph shows those carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel and industrial sources but you have to add another 4 or so gigatons, that's billions of tons, for land use change if you want to get the full picture of carbon dioxide emissions. And the current projections are for those emissions to go up again this year. So perhaps about 0.6% rise compared with last year. So we haven't started the long journey down in terms of our carbon dioxide emissions. And because of the way carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, that we're seeing record levels of increases in carbon dioxide. So last year it went up 3.75 parts per million, and that is well above a 1.5 degree compatible pathway. We also have seen record levels of methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere. So methane is now almost triple pre-industrial levels, whereas carbon dioxide is about 52% above pre-industrial levels. And when we look at our carbon budget, and I'll talk more about this shortly, that's running out very quickly. We've got about 3 years left before we've run out of greenhouse gas emissions that are compatible with 1.5 degrees. If we're to get serious about climate change, we actually need to change that upwards trajectory into a downwards trajectory, and it needs to look something like this, that dashed line that we see there. And that dashed line should not stop at the bottom of this graph. It should keep on going down this graph until it hits 0. And we're nowhere near that trajectory. And I'll show you an IPCC graph of this soon. But what we're seeing is, in spite of the fact that the Paris Agreement says that we need to reduce emissions, in spite of the fact that the economics of climate change is now very clear that not reducing emissions is the most expensive economic prospect, we still see incredible pressures to open up new coal, oil, and gas fields across the world, and to increase greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not, and it varies from place to place. So some places are pushing down on those emissions, some are pushing up on those emissions. And one indicator of how hard this is to change is that, according to the International Monetary Fund, last year there was about $7 trillion of fossil fuel subsidies provided across the globe. So this is going to be really hard to change because of that economic drive. Now, we've known for a long time now, over 200 years, that if we put greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, we'll warm the Earth. This is a graph of global temperatures from the World Meteorological Organization going back to the 1800s. And you can see that acceleration of temperature increase over recent times, with last year being the first year above 1.5 degrees, reaching 1.55 above pre-industrial levels. And we can see from that graph also that the hottest 10 years on record are the last 10 years. So the message about climate change and accelerating temperature increase is really strong. This year, we're probably going to be the second or third hottest on record. So we won't be above last year's record, but we'll still be amongst the top few years in terms of global temperature. That increasingly is impacting on systems right across the globe. And this is a very short summary of an incredibly big list. But what we see across the globe is extreme events ramping up in frequency, in intensity, and in some cases severity. So we see this with heat waves across our land and ocean, which have been extraordinarily large, particularly the ocean heat waves last year. And even as we speak, there's heat waves in Europe and other places. We're seeing increased risk from floods and cyclones and storms, which are associated with increased rainfall intensity, because as the global temperature goes up, sub-hourly or short-term rainfall intensity is increasing very quickly. And that's associated with a very rapid increase in the water cycle. So the global water cycle is going up at twice the rate that either the theory or the global climate models would indicate. We're seeing increased risk from fires, increased risk from droughts. And of course, a major issue for Pacific Islands is we see sea level rise accelerating. So on average last century, it was going up about 1.8 millimeters per year. This century, it's about 4 and a bit millimeters per year. The last few years have been about 6 millimeters per year. We've also seen increases in wave energy, something that a lot of people haven't cottoned onto or haven't understood. But as global temperatures are increased, there's more energy being moved across the globe. There's more mass being moved across the globe in wind fields, and that generates stronger wave energy. And across the globe, wave energy has increased by about 30% over the last several decades. So that's your average wave that impacts on your island's shorelines. We've also seen big changes in ocean currents, with currents in the Atlantic, Pacific, Indian Oceans, and Southern Ocean changing, and changing in ways which are quite concerning because they relate to climate in the Pacific as well as other places. And all of these change in climate-related hazards are impacting on health, with increased health issues, water and food security, with agriculture being pulled back significantly by climate change, and impacting on biodiversity. So a couple of examples in our part of the world is in the Torres Strait Islands, the northern tip of Australia. We've had the first mammalian climate change extinction. That's because those Torres Strait Islands, many of them are very low-lying, muddy islands. Sea level rise means those islands no longer exist, and this little animal which lives on those islands also no longer exists. As we speak, we see massive coral bleaching happening at Ningaloo Reef off the northern part of Australia, reflecting what's already been happening across big parts of the Pacific and the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. If we look at our emission trajectories, they're challenging in terms of 1.5 degrees. This is an IPCC report, which shows in the black line on the left what has happened in emissions over the last several decades. The red line and red plume of colours, or orange colours that stretch out to the right, are where we're going with implemented policies. And where we need to go is those green or blue trajectories, which are consistent with 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, the blue one being the 1.5 degree trajectory. And you can see the difference between where we currently are going and where we need to go to be consistent with 1.5 degrees is huge. So for many legacy industries and countries which are wedded to industries and activities of the past, this is a big threat. But to those industries and those countries which are actually looking to the future, this is a huge opportunity. So we need to reflect that this gap between where we're going and where we need to go can be very different depending on where you stand. We are moving towards 1.5 degrees very quickly because of that continued increase in greenhouse gas emissions. This is a graph from the Copernicus Climate Group in Europe, and what they've done is they've just taken the temperatures, monthly temperatures over the last 30 years and stretching back further than that, but they've just drawn a straight line regression or line of best fit through those temperatures. And then they've extrapolated that out to the future, so taken that out to the future and said, where does this intersect with the 1.5 degrees line? And the answer, unfortunately, is it hits around about the first quarter of, or second quarter of 2029. So that's only 4 years away. And so the message of urgency in terms of meeting 1.5 degrees on a trend basis is very strong. If we actually do something a little bit more consistent with the data and fit a curved line, that accelerating change line that I talked about before, we actually see that we reach 1.5 degrees on a trend basis next year. So in terms of thinking about 1.5 degrees, if we're looking at a trend basis, then we're actually pretty much at 1.5 degrees right now. There are different ways of measuring this, and there's no single agreed approach, because some people say you should take a long-term average, which of course pulls back the current temperature down to about 1.25 degrees, in which case we'd still get to 1.5 degrees in the early 2030s. Consequently, there's a lot of urgency in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to stay within our global carbon budget that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. So as I mentioned before, is that a budget that's consistent with a 50-50 chance, so it's an even chance of keeping to 1.5 degrees, as of the start of this year, is 130 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, we're emitting currently around about 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide a year. And if you do the simple maths, 130 divided by 40, that gives about 3 years left before we've completely blown that budget that's consistent with 1.5 degrees. So because of that huge momentum or inertia in terms of change that I showed you before, we have to be thinking about overshoot scenarios in terms of 1.5 degrees. So that's exceeding 1.5 degrees and then coming back to 1.5 degrees, which is going to be a big challenge because we not only have to go to net zero for carbon dioxide emissions, we have to go below zero. And that's a really significant change. Now, of course, that budget is higher for greater temperatures. For example, if we were thinking about 2 degrees, and of course, that budget is also lower if we want to have more certainty of achieving a given temperature. So there's no single carbon budget. It depends on what your temperature goal is and how sure you want to be of getting to that. But one of the things that is very clear is that every year that we continue to emit at high levels, like we currently are, brings forward the date of net zero targets by about 2 degrees. So instead of being 2050, it becomes 2048 and then 2046 and then 2044. So that simple maths is really important. There is no time to waste in terms of reducing emissions. And then the last slide is just, I was asked to comment about some specific risks in terms of the Pacific. And what I thought I'd do is actually paint out a picture of complex risk, because this is much more the way in which people are now seeing and experience risk. So I've put a series of risks down that list, the dot points, from sea level rise down to change in marine productivity. And what I've just done is put that bracket against related complex risks. So for example, if you're a low-lying Pacific island, the linkage between increased cyclone strength, the average increase in wave energy, and sea level rise together significantly increase the risks of erosion and other damaging factors in terms of your island system. If we look at another grouping, which is increased cyclone strength, changes in drought, food and water security, and changes in the El Nino system, that's the El Nino La Nina system, we see those are linked as well. So for example, changes in El Nino, you go to a more El Nino or La Nina state, changes drought and water status and food status on Pacific islands across the Pacific. And that's linked to cyclone strength, which can significantly change drought and food, and cyclones themselves linked to El Nino. So they tend to travel further west in La Nina years and further east in El Nino years. And the last package of risks is changes in El Nino linked to ocean heat waves, linked to ocean acidification, and linked with reductions in marine productivity and biodiversity challenges. So again, these are linked factors. So for example, if we go into a La Nina, that linked into ocean heat waves means we're going to get much, much higher levels of temperature in the Western Pacific than we normally would. That links into ocean acidification and other threatening processes for some of our systems, and that then follows through to reductions in marine productivity. So I just was wanting to flag that we need to be increasingly thinking about packages of change rather than single changes in a sea level rise by itself, changes in El Nino by itself, etc. So I think this is one of the ways in which we can start to frame risks for the Pacific. So I'll just leave that there, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Mark. I think you've provided a very good scenario on the 1.5 degrees trajectory. But also, I think talking about the complexity of multiple risks on climate change in the region, and for the Pacific, where everything is connected on islands, I think it is even more critical as we try to keep 1.5 alive within the whole emission reduction scenario. We really appreciate your presentation, Professor Mark. I'm not sure if you're able to stay with us online for questions, but I'm sure there's a lot of interests from our participants on your presentation. So we'll ask you to please type in your questions in the Q&A box, and we will come back to you at the end of the webinar. So thank you, Professor Mark. I think the time frame is not looking very well in terms of keeping 1.5 alive, which means our negotiation strategy within the region must also reflect that within the UNFCCC process. And so I think that is something that we a message that we wanted to come out strongly from our webinar today. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Isabella from Kiribati. Isabel, as I've introduced, is a young professional working for the Climate Change Office in Kiribati, and she's joining us all the way from Christmas Island. I think Kiribati is one of the most vulnerable countries in the region, and we would really like to hear from her on her work experience on the ground, but also reflecting on the need for regional advocacy. I'm sure there's a lot of initiatives happening in the Pacific and globally, but Isabella, we wanted to hear from your experience, also reflecting on the presentation by Mark. Thank you, Isabella. Are you able to hear us?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. And are you able to turn on your camera as well?
Sorry?
Are you able to turn on your camera?
Oh, I apologize. So first of all, I just want to apologize if there's any background noises, because I'm in the middle of my community surveys, and I'm using my lunch break to join in this webinar. So I'm not really in the perfect state to turn on my camera, if you understand. And also, I just want to apologize in advance for any background noises. This is the only place I could find with good connection so I could join. But other than that, I just want to start off and greet you all. Talofa and warm Pacific greetings to you all. It is an honor. It is an honor and a privilege to be able to join this webinar, and I want to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be able to speak on my experiences as a youth in youth advocacy for climate change, and also as my career as a climate change adaptation advisor. And before I move on, I just want to give a brief background of Kiribati and the climate and how we experience climate change. So in Kiribati, we all know Kiribati is a small island. It is a low-lying atoll. It consists of 33 atolls, and within this, we have as mentioned by Fred, the impacts of climate change is extreme for the citizens of Kiribati, which is why it is important that we strengthen regional advocacy. I want to speak on why regional advocacy is important, why it matters, before I move on to speaking anything else. So in the Pacific, you all know climate change isn't limited by borders. Climate change isn't contained by borders. We all experience climate change, and we all experience different impacts of climate change. But as a whole, as a region, we all experience climate change differently. And there's some areas that we experience climate change the same. But I just want to speak on the importance of regional advocacy as a youth. We, as a region that shares the same challenges, we also require the same the same shared solutions, which is why this is important, because when we strengthen regional advocacy, we're pooling knowledges, resources, and strategies for stronger and more coordinated responses. When I look at regional advocacy, I look at it as unity, and there's strength in unity, and I'd like to look at unity like this is how I look at unity from my perspective. Unity for me is like it's like a braid, a three-stranded braid. When you braid together and tightly knit these three strands, the rope becomes really strong, and that is what regional advocacy is like. When we all collaborate, we combine, we come to agreement, we unite in one cause. This is what our unity, this is what our response looks like to the world. We are strong, we are unbreakable, we are loud, and I believe that when we come together, our responses cannot be unheard. We cannot be silenced because we are strong. But if we have a single strand on its own, it's weak. But coming together makes our response stronger, which is why strengthening regional advocacy matters. As we can also see, through regional advocacy, we have already achieved progress in global negotiations. And one example I'd like to use in relation to youth is the PISF Pacific Island Students Fighting for Climate Change, where they went to the highest court, and they issued an advisory opinion on climate change. And this wasn't just one region. This wasn't just one nation coming to the highest court. It was comprised of students from different nations across the Pacific, and I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to also deliver a testimony in the Netherlands for this for the ICJAO, and that was successful, and that was all youth, and that was all regional. So this is the importance of regional advocacy. People may look at us as youth, but this shows that youth also have the power to achieve to progress in global negotiations and in global platforms, just like what has happened recently in July. That is an example of what youth regional advocacy does. And also, if to speak more on the theme of today's webinar, keeping 1.5 alive, and also ensuring that the new collective quantified goal delivers scaled up predictable finance is, I think, to speak from my perspective as a person who's working in the climate change sector in Kiribati, things that we've noticed, that we've experienced, is that we can come up with many project ideas. We have a lot of climate change committees coming up with project ideas, coming up with adaptation measures, coming up with a lot of solutions that hold potential. But the only problem is the climate financing. There's limited climate finance to make these ideas into reality, to actually make them put into action. And this is something that we've noticed. We've come up with so many plans, so many activities, so many project ideas, but there's limited funding and climate finance to support these ideas, which is why my call to action today is clear. We must keep the 1.45 goal alive through ambitious emission cuts. We must ensure that the new collective quantified goal delivers scaled up, predictable finance that is accessible to SPREP. And we must invest in youth-led initiatives, education, and leadership pathways. One thing I noticed that we can have many initiatives, we can have many ideas, but in reality, these all need money and finance to put into reality. And that is why I'm emphasizing on ensuring that the new collective quantified goal delivers what it's supposed to deliver in terms of climate financing. And also, I want to speak upon another point that I want to talk about today, is also the importance of youth inclusion in decision making. So as a Pacific Islander, we all know that there's a stereotype, or there's like a stigma that the voices of youth in decision making aren't counted as important. But nowadays we can see that there's been a shift where we're seeing more youth empowerment going on in the Pacific. We're seeing more youth-led initiatives happening. We're seeing youth rising up and stepping up to the platforms. And this is why I think as a young Pacific Islander, I believe that youth have a critical role to play in this advocacy. We're not just leaders of tomorrow. We are starting to lead today. And this is our future is something that we need to be concerned about. And to be able to be involved in decision making now will also impact how we will live our future as youth, as the future leaders of tomorrow. If we start in being involved now, seeing what kind of decisions are being made for our future, I think this is why we should include the youth, because they come with fresh, innovative ideas. But I want to emphasize in including youth in a respective manner, not in a way that we will overstep our leaders, but in a way that we will work in harmony with our leaders, that they will also see our perspectives and that we will not disrespect what our leaders are doing today, but we'll work in harmony with them to also provide our ideas, our innovations, and how we want to see our tomorrow and what we can do to contribute to decision making. And also, I just really, as a youth, I just really enjoy the climate change area, because it's something you never run out of doing. There's always something to do within the climate change area. And advocacy for those of you who haven't gotten into advocacy is it's really fun, and it doesn't need you to study, because you advocate for what you're experiencing right now. And if we all come together, we all know that different communities have different problems, and coming together is like what I've explained before. It's like a 3-strand braid. When we come together with all our challenges, all our issues, and we come together and we voice out and amplify our voices as youth, we don't need to study a master's to be able to advocate. If you have the voice, you can speak now. If you whatever you're going through, that's why whatever you're going through is why advocacy is there, and why we have youth-led initiatives within our different communities, in our different countries. For Kiribati, we're starting to have multiple youth-led initiatives, but I'm also a executive board member of the first youth-led organization in Kiribati called Tungari Youth Action. And this is where I first started my advocacy in 2022. And I knew a little about climate change, but I came to realize as I was joining these youth-led initiatives, it's really just your own story. What story do you have to tell? What story do you want the world to hear? What story do you want the world to not ignore? What story do you not want to be unseen? What story do you want to be seen? What story do you have that wants to be seen out there? Our story has impacts, and our story is something that that we can bring to the global negotiations, and that's how strengthening regional advocacy works. We come together with all our stories, all our challenges, all our issues, and as we speak together and we amplify each other's voices, we can progress as youth, and also be able to be a part of decision making, and also to see what our future would look like if we start looking through decision making now. And I think that's all I want to speak about today. And I apologize for the noise, and I apologize if I've been speaking too fast. My lunch break is almost over, but I'm very fortunate to be able to have this opportunity to join in, and that's all I have from here. And Gambesindaba.
Thank you very much, Isabella, for telling your story. I think your example of the ICJ opinion is an example of how Pacific youths are able to influence global decisions and even the future of humankind. And there's no better place to join us from than on actual doing the work on the ground, Isabella, while some of us are enjoying the aircon. You are responding to climate change on the ground. And we really appreciate you taking your time and speaking the voice of the young people who are impacting communities right across the Pacific. So we appreciate you, and thank you very much, Isabella, for joining us. Moving forward, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is very well known in the region, Anne Rasmussen. She's the lead negotiator for AUCs. And I think will share on her experience leading the negotiations and making the deals behind closed doors within the UNFCCC negotiation dynamics. But Anne, one of the things that Professor Matt talked about as well is that the fossil fuel subsidies are really, for example, he says it's about 7 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. The NCQG figure, or the what we could say, the perceptive quantum that came out of Baku is 1.3 trillion. It begs the question of whether the amount of resources that is being committed towards climate finance is sufficient enough to transition economies to achieving 1.5, or should we just keep adapting? I think those are the questions that I think provides us with a bit of your experience and your knowledge, and would help answer some of these questions, so that when we approach the negotiations, I think utilizing the mechanisms that we have in order for us to become more effective in ensuring that 1.5 is alive. So Anne, I will hand it over to you. I know you're in Samoa, so you're enjoying the sunshine there, but please, if you can turn on your video, Anne, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Fred. Can you all hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, Anne. Please go ahead.
Thank you. And always a pleasure to address our dear colleagues today on the invitation to be part of this panel. I was really happy to hear the presentation, the science presentation earlier, and hearing the youth, and my good friend and colleague, Ambassador Felsen, who is the lead climate finance negotiator for AOCs, is also speaking after me. So I think the questions that Fred had asked about finance would be directed to her, but I'll try my best to answer, given that I've been asked to address today, reflect on the lessons learned of COP29, and of course prepare for COP30, and of course reaffirming the special circumstances of small island developing states in these negotiations. First, I'd like to talk about the lessons from COP29 in Baku, with which we had a lot of you delegates from the regions attend. So the COP29 is a sobering reminder of both the urgency of this crisis and the fragility of our collective response. The adoption of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance that Fred had alluded to, the 300 billion is the goal that replaced the 100 billion, so that we can just want to make this clear. The 1.3 trillion is not the goal, the 300 billion. The 1.3 trillion is the efforts to get there by 2035. So I think Ambassador Felsen will speak to this. So the adoption of the new NCQG was on the surface a step forward, but for small island developing states, the outcome was painfully insufficient. Numbers without accessibility, allocation flaws, predictability, and justice are just promises on paper. At COP29 in Baku, the energy agenda also, which gained a lot of momentum with the Dubai energy package, faltered, despite the urgency of translating the global stocktake into tangible action. Parties did fail to reach a consensus on a cover decision to drive forward COP28's energy commitments, leaving the vital pledge to transition away from fossil fuels in a limbo. Proposed mechanisms to operationalize the tripling of the renewable energy and doubling of the energy efficiency targets, such as the annual dialogues, the progress, reporting, and frameworks for storage and grid expansion were all rejected. In effect, the much-needed energy package was overshadowed, stalled in procedural paralysis, and politically sidelined towards COP30 in Brazil. COP29 also showed us that small island developing states remain moral leaders. The walkout by the Alliance of Small Island States and our allies, mainly the LDCs, at COP29 climate finance discussion at the last day, at the final day, we chose to walk out of a process that excluded us, but we weren't walking out or refused to engage. It was a demand for fairness, for respect, for the inclusion of the very countries whose survival is at stake. That act spoke louder than words and reminded the world that our voices cannot be sidelined. Coming to the other one, the urgency of the 1.5, and it was good to hear the presentation earlier by our scientists and also within the IPCC. To small islands, to the world, they may treat 1.5 as a statistic, but for us, it's a survival limit, as we could see all the trajectory and the impacts of every degree of warming has towards our parts of the world. And the fact that in 2024, we crossed that line, even temporarily, wasn't just a warning bell. I think it was a signal flare, so our homes are already on the front lines. And this was a message we gave last week as well when we had a discussion at the Climate Change Roundtable, but we wanted to be clear, and I'm sure the science presentation also highlighted, we have not reached permanent overshoot of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement measures this goal over a 20-year average. So getting back on track is still achievable. But the models show that we have just about 2 years based on the scientist presentation earlier. We have about 3 years of emissions left, about 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide before we blow past that carbon budget. So what we have now is not a timeline, it is a countdown. And for small island developing states, when the clock hits 0, so do our chances. Overshoot, even temporarily, could be catastrophic for us, pushing us past tipping points that cannot be reversed. As you see from the presentation, which was really, really well delivered, already our coral reefs are dying, our fisheries are collapsing, and our coastlines are retreating. And at 2 degrees Celsius, our entire ecosystems may vanish. The risk of extreme heat triples, and our cultures are pushed toward extinction. This brings me to my third point on the science and the law. Science is not ambiguous, as per the presentation we heard earlier. Emissions must peak by 2025 and fall by half this decade. Anything less is a failure and a broken Paris Agreement. Some have questioned the legitimacy of the science and the overshoot as well, but just weeks ago, the International Court of Justice made it clear the IPCC is the gold standard. In its landmark advisory opinion, the court declared that the IPCC reports constitute the best available science on the causes, nature, and consequences of climate change. The ICJ further confirmed that the 1.5 degree limit, not 2 degrees, has become the consensus target under the international law. This legal clarity matters. The Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is now anchored not only in science and morality, but also in international law. It binds all of us. On AOS's priorities, Alliance of Small Island States priorities for COP30, and when I say AOS's, Alliance of Small Island States, it is the body of the 3 regions where AOSIDS are located. So we have Pacific in AOSIS, we have CARICOM in AOSIS, and we have Indian Ocean in AOSIS. So this is a collective effort. As we look towards Belém, we cannot afford another incremental outcome. We must deliver ambitious NDCs. These countries must submit the 1.5 aligned NDCs. Again, referring to the presentation by our colleague earlier, the different scenarios and the trajectory to head towards the 1.5 and 2 degree. It is still possible if the high emitters really come to the table with high ambition and produce 1.5 aligned NDCs. They must reflect the highest possible ambition. And as the advisory opinion from the ICJs reminded us, collectively add up to the 1.5 degree pathway. On climate finance, the new goal must be transformational and not transactional. Finance must be predictable, adequate, and accessible, and delivered as grants or highly concessional flows and not as loans that trap us in debt. The ICJ has also been clear that cooperation through finance, technology, and capacity building is not charity. It is a legal obligation. On loss and damage, the fund must be capitalized and operationalized every year, and every year of delay costs lives, livelihoods, and entire cultures. On energy transition, in COP30, we must accelerate delivery of the Dubai energy package. Tripling of the renewables and doubling efficiency ensuring SPREP benefit directly through mechanisms that de-risk investment, transfer technology, and build capacity. And as you know, adaptation, we are near the conclusion of the UAE Belém work program on indicators. It is a priority for AOSIS that we adopt a small coherent package of indicators at COP30 in Belém to measure progress on the GGA. In particular, these indicators on the means of implementations are critical for this package. AOSIS for the Alliance of Small Island States measuring the provision of the means of implementation, the quality of it, the access, and being able to identify the needs and gaps would be instrumental in funneling the resources necessary to support and advance adaptation action on the ground. And now I turn to my last point on the special circumstances of SPREP. Like I said earlier before, our special circumstances are not a plea for sympathy. It is a recognition of reality, and it is already included in the Paris Agreement in the whole Article 9. And of course, as we have said, we did not cause the crisis, yet we are expected to pay the price. We are very small in size, but vast in moral authority. The ICJ has also reminded the world breaches of obligations give rise to consequences, including the right to seek compensation. That is not a threat, it is a statement of law, and SPREP have fought uphill battles before. I think our fight is about survival and about justice. It is about ensuring that every child in small island developing states and also the Pacific can grow up in a homeland that is safe, resilient, and thriving. In closing, colleagues, the road from Baku to Belém is short and the clock is ticking. We cannot negotiate with the atmosphere. We cannot survive broken promises. The 1.5-degree goal is our lifeline. Finance is our right. Inclusion is our demand, and ambition is our only option. Let us work together at COP30. Be remembered not as another step, but as a turning point when the world finally matched its words with action, and when the survival of small islands became the measure of climate justice. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for those reflections and also capturing the whole spectrum of agenda items and issues and the priorities of AOSIS, going into learning from COP29 and going into COP30. I think Anne has touched on one of the fundamental issues for us, the Pacific SPREP, which is this is about survival, and survival is linked to 1.5 and higher ambition. And so I think, Anne, you've really captured the essence of the fact that survival is synonymous with achieving 1.5, which means that the higher emitters should be held accountable. And that is an area that we should engage our energy and a lot of advocacy in, as we've been doing so far. I think the second point you raised, Anne, on justice and the right to finance is also an important one in the Baku to Belém roadmap, operationalizing the special circumstance of SPREP. I think this is a discussion that is happening already within the PSIDS, going forward into COP30. Our next speaker is Ambassador Janine, and I want to take this opportunity to welcome Your Excellency, Janine. We appreciate making time I think the discussions around 1.5, the Baku to Belém roadmap, and the operationalization of the special circumstance seed of seeds. And I think, Janine, I think with your oversight and experience, you could bring that whole different strands together going forward into COP30. We've had the discussion on the science, the discussion on youth engagement. We've had reflections from Anne on the experience within and the key agendas for AOSIS. Janine, we welcome you to speak and bring all that together for our session this morning. Thank you, Ambassador Janine.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation and my sincere apologies for joining late. So I missed Anne's wonderful presentation and all the previous presentations. And I wanted to share a little bit of the overview of the NCQG decision, the new Collective Quantified Coal decision. But if that's something that you've gone through, I'm happy to give more strategic insights if you would prefer that.
Yeah, Janine, please go ahead. We haven't touched specifically on the NCQG, and I think it would be good to also reflect on how you see the special circumstance of seeds being operationalized within the discussions as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. I can do that. I do have a presentation, which I'm happy to share. If I'm not able to do so, I can send it to you guys, and then you can maybe share it with your colleagues. But I'll attempt to share if that's possible.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Just let me know if you're seeing my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let me just quickly, this issue of the special circumstances of small island developing states has been an issue for the entire history of the UNFCCC, the climate change process. It is perhaps a kernel of the foundation of the UNFCCC process itself. It is why we engaged, it is why we even came together, and it is why we vehemently defend it. And we defend it in all fora, not just in climate change, but we've done it in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda, in the context of the Financing for Development Agenda. And as you are all very much more intimately engaged with, it has been firmly, wrongly defended in the context of the various judicial processes that have been invoked to address international legal obligations on not only climate change generally, but also in relation to matters relating to climate finance. The historical background to the new collective quantified goal emanates from the original climate finance commitment that we had with the 100 billion, which was agreed or confirmed in 2010 in Cancun, and which has long defined the debate on climate finance. The paradigm itself has always been developed to developing country paradigm that we've focused on as small island developing states. But as the discussions have evolved over time, there has been significant pressure to break down that bifurcated approach to developed and developing countries in the context of climate finance. That has been a concern, especially for small island developing states, which are countries, territories that span a spectrum of development. So we have from low income or least developed countries right through to the categories that the World Bank classify as high income countries. But what's unique about small island developing states are those circumstances that just make us acutely vulnerable to issues of exogenous shocks, including environmental shocks, environmental systems and processes, And for that reason, it's really important that the climate finance paradigm that has long defined and is definitive in the climate change convention itself continues to inform the frameworks that we have in terms of the new iteration of the climate finance goal. So the new collective climate finance goal comes out of the 100 billion discussion, and it is a successor to that. Let's see. I'm trying to change my screen. There it goes. So I'll just give you an overview of the NCQG. It'll be a very crowded slide. It's a slide that the Alliance of Small Island States utilizes, and I think we should always be consistent with what we're sharing. So I will just utilize that to give you the overview. We'll go into the SID-specific provisions. We'll talk about the Baku to Belém roadmap, which is a component of the new collective quantified goal. It speaks to the $1.3 trillion aspirational goal that's embedded in the NCQG decision. We'll go through SIDS positions on Baku to Belém roadmap. And I wanted to just share a recent paper and some policy options which are interesting, and maybe something that can further inform some strategic thinking looking forward. So the new collective quantified goal has two goals. One is a mobilization goal that that we know now as the $300 billion goal. Its time frame is to 2035. It is negotiated under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, specifically as it relates to mobilization. It's not a provision goal, so it's not that if you know the structure of the Paris Agreement, there's Article 9.1, which repeats what Article 4 from the Framework Convention had stated as developed countries providing support to developing countries. It's not that one. It's about mobilization with developed countries taking the lead in the mobilization of the finance for developing countries. That 300 billion speaks to a wide context for which the finance will be mobilized, specifically in the context of meaningful mitigation, adaptation, and transparency. That's a legacy from the 100 billion. It does not speak specifically to any quantitative aspects for any thematic issues, not on adaptation, not on mitigation, not on loss and damage, not on any of the cross-cutting themes like readiness and transparency. I see that there's a hand maybe that went up. I'll continue, but interrupt me if you need me to stop. It speaks to different types of access features, which I will get into. So it's the first time that a climate finance decision speaks to qualitative issues, which is something that gets picked up in the paper that I will speak to at the end. And it does include some transparency provisions. But let's talk about the 1.3 trillion. Now, is that a climate finance goal? Well, there are mixed views on that. It is an aspirational goal. It speaks to all actors. So it's not just state actors, but non-state actors as well. And there is a process that is intended to elaborate how we get to that 1.3 trillion. And I think it's relevant that we speak to this from a strategic point of view. Now, what are the SID-specific provisions on the new collective quantified goal? Well, this area really addresses the issues around the access features. It's an area that small island developing states had advocated strongly for. Because access has always been a challenge for SIDS. Access to actually get in through the door, but access to the actual scale of finance that the countries need to respond to climate change, whether it's in the context of mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage. So there are some specific or targeted provisions within the NCQG decision that addresses the different channels that finance tends to go through. In the first instance, there's a call to all, or urging to all climate finance channels to enhance the efficient and effective access to climate finance. And there's a specific reference to SIDS and LDCs, and to eliminate conditionalities to access. There's a specific urging to bilateral providers of finance to institute measures to substantially increase finance to SIDS and LDCs. There's a call to international financial institutions, including the multilateral development banks, to drastically, to use the terms, scale up highly concessional finance to SIDS and LDCs, and to also increase grant financing to SIDS and LDCs. There's a targeted provision to multilateral climate funds, and these are the ones that we have had some provisions that address minimum allocation for SIDS and LDCs. So we have the Green Climate Fund, which had the 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation, and a further split within the context of the adaptation allocation. We have the Adaptation Fund. We have the Special Climate Change Fund, the LDC Fund. All of these have some specific provisions. So this was seen as a way in which to operationalize that further increase of finance to SIDS, but it's not specifically targeting SIDS and LDCs in its language, but it specifically states that there is a commitment by the providers to significantly increase public resources going through these specific funds, the multilateral climate funds, with a view to scaling up their share of finance that's delivered. And that figure that that has been quoted in the NCQG is to at least triple annual outflows from these funds. So the idea is that that would trickle down to SIDS and LDCs. And of course, quite importantly, in the transparency provisions, there is a requirement for disaggregated information related to finance that is provided or mobilized for SIDS and LDCs. Let me go on. So I mentioned the Baku to Belém roadmap and this aspirational goal for 1.3 trillion, which is aimed at scaling up climate finance. Now, this is where the NCQG actually acknowledges that the needs of all countries extends into the trillions of dollars, not the hundreds of billions, which is what we have in the mobilization goal, but the trillions. But here is where you start to see a little changing of the guards here of who's going to be doing what, because now we have all actors being brought into the context of a climate finance decision. This is not a bad thing necessarily, but it's useful to bear that in mind because it means that everybody is responsible. And some would say if everyone is responsible, no one is actually responsible. But in any case, this 1.3 trillion is aimed towards mobilizing finance to better address the large-scale needs of developing country parties and the presidencies of the COP29, which is the presidency of the Azerbaijan, and the incoming presidency of COP30, which is Brazil. They're supposed to produce a work summarizing the work that they have done on the development of this roadmap, and I'll just give you a little snapshot of what they're doing. So they've had several iterations of how they can do this process through requests for inputs and submissions on the process for the development of the roadmap. They are doing this engagement, which they call a structured engagement and outreach to parties and other stakeholders. And they're also engaging with preparation of technical inputs into the development of the roadmap. They recently updated this work plan, so this is the latest that I have. There is a request, a more recent request to make submissions by the 10th of September. There's a proposal to publish a roadmap by the 27th of October, and the presidency's report would be prepared by then in time for the CMA7. Now, what is this looking like? This very well may have evolved from when last this issue was discussed, but the areas that have been the areas of interest in the Baku to Belém roadmap have been on the concessional finance and optimizing climate funds. So if you think back to what I just mentioned about some of those calls to the different finance providers, from the bilateral to the multilateral, you could see this being an area where that could be operationalized, optimizing the climate funds, As I mentioned, there's a commitment to triple annual or to increase funds going into those multilateral climate funds with a view to tripling the annual outflows of those funds. There's a focus on reforming the multilateral development banks. Of course, this is an area that's been has had a lot of interest across many different agendas, but it definitely has come into the climate change process because there are ways in which the capital that's available to be invested into developing countries could be expanded through various adjustments in the multilateral development banks. Now, the extent to which this is going to be gaining a lot of traction under the current political dynamics that have colored the climate finance negotiations, that is yet to be seen. There's a focus on domestic resource mobilization. As I mentioned, 1.3 trillion is not limited to developed countries alone. It's all actors. So all SIDS are included in this. And then there's a focus on the private capital mobilization with an interest in addressing innovative financial instruments and regulatory approaches. So dealing with how risk is being integrated into capital investments or disclosures, how climate risk is being addressed in that context. Now, as I said, this is not static. It's probably looking different. There is an expectation that at least in the current round of inputs, we will be seeing what existing initiatives might be able to be addressed in the context of the Baku to Belém roadmap to further that move towards 1.3 trillion. So where does that put the SIDS though? Because if it's everybody, then how do we get a targeted approach for small island developing states? Well, we do have the decision to go by. The new collective quantified goal does speak to all those different channels. So if I just go back one, to each one of these points, there is something to be said for small island developing states. And we can go back to the beginning where I started with the specific references in the NCQG decision, and we have the foundation of what could be integrated into the Baku to Belém roadmap. So it is an area where SIDS could continue to advocate to see a clearer delineation of how those provisions are going to be operationalized for SIDS with a more bespoke approach to each of the climate finance channels. Please flag me if I'm going too long, because I can talk a long time on this. Just to jump to a totally different issue here. I think as I mentioned, there are many different interpretations of this goal. Some like it, some hate it, some think it's okay. This recent article, and I'll tell you by whom. This is a paper by Rocky Mountain Institute and a couple others. I can share the link. Anyways, they're taking an approach as to the innovative approach to the access framework and NCQG decision, which I found interesting and I thought I would share. So they've taken each one of the access challenges, how the NCQG addresses it, and then the policy recommendation is their own thinking. But it's a useful framework potentially for strategic thinking on how we might want to approach how SIDS. Sorry, I always involve myself in SIDS as a we, so I will go back and forth there, but this might be a framework to contemplate how SIDS can utilize that language with a view to making inputs into that NCQG Baku to Belém roadmap, which will be discussed or digested in CMA 7. And as I mentioned, there is a call for inputs through to September 10th. So it looked at institutional and technical capacity gaps. And there is a focus on emphasizing tailored support for SIDS and LDCs. And their policy recommendation is to expand the support for SIDS and LDCs to build their capacity to be able to deal with those technical capacity gaps. Now, this is not inconsistent with what was being advocated during the NCQG negotiations. So there is a connection there. It speaks to procedural and bureaucratic complexity. Again, something that SIDS, in fact, SIDS representatives on the Green Climate Fund had addressed some of this and started the whole simplified approval procedures. Again, this is an area that can be furthered through the Baku to Belém roadmap. Some focus on the issues around MDB risk frameworks and restrictive financing models, and looking at how the MDBs might use different types of instruments to address the issues around risk. It doesn't always have to be about risk, but this is their policy provisions. In terms of transparency, there's this tracking that's integrated into the NCQG, which is very important, and that's where we SIDS could look for a bespoke model on how those different finance providers are delivering on those commitments or encouragements or urgings from the NCQG decision, in order for there to be a better sense of how things are working in the SIDS favor. And dealing now with those actors who are engaged in climate action in SIDS communities, but who are unable to access finance. It's looking at how, what types of policy recommendations could be included in there. I haven't fully digested this report, but I think this is not a far-fetched framework, and potentially we SIDS can utilize this idea of, well, can the NCQG access framework now be retooled to specifically address SIDS issues in the context of a roadmap that's looking to 1.3 trillion, but it could easily also be within the context of different climate finance tracks in the climate change process. I'm going to end there because maybe I'm totally off base, or you might want to ask me some questions for clarification, and I'm happy to jump back in. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jenin. I think you've captured the essence of what we were expecting from you, in particular the NCQG, and some thinking around how the special circumstance of SID could be part of the Baku to Belém roadmap as well. And you've provided some good examples around some of the tools, some of the table that you've just shown, but also discussions around the role of MDBs in accessing climate finance. So thank you very much, Ambassador. I don't know if there is any specific question, but before we go to some of the questions, Ambassador Jenin, while you're online, I just want to ask you one question just before we open it up. Just quickly on your reflections on the 1.3 trillion as an aspirational goal, and the relationship towards one of the key priorities for SIDS, which is keeping 1.5 alive. Is a lot of the investment for the 1.3 trillion, or maybe the discussions around the Baku to Belém roadmap, focused on investment for adaptation? Or is it also something that our larger emitters within the developing country parties could provide pathways towards getting us closer to 1.5 degrees? It sounded like it is a goal, mostly the financial flows is mostly towards developing countries. Largely for us, it's enhanced access for SIDS. But in terms of achieving 1.5, is there pathways for our larger emitters within the developing country parties outside of the mitigation work program, for example, or the energy transition discussions?
Now, this is a very interesting question. So, how can I be? So first of all, there is a existential question about the 1.3 trillion roadmap, whether or not it's something that will have a life beyond CMA 7. So I think we need to be conscious of that, and no, SIDS need to be conscious of that, so that issues that may find their way in there that could be favorable to SIDS could also find their way into other processes. You mentioned specifically on the matter of adaptation. And you will recall that there was nothing in the NCQG itself that dedicated a quantitative amount for adaptation. So we're kind of still looking at the balance between mitigation and adaptation. But of course, we have loss and damage, which is hundreds of millions of dollars per year. And there are many different estimates on that. So let's try to keep things in perspective and recognize that 1.3 trillion might be limited. Second, if you recall my outline, so we talked about concessional finance, you talk about domestic reform in the MDBs, which might open up some finance, but where have those finance flows been going mostly? Mostly to mitigation. So unless there's a drastic change in the focus of these different providers to address adaptation, will we end up where we are right now with more focus on mitigation and less on adaptation when SIDS need more adaptation? I mean, we could use mitigation finance. SIDS can use mitigation finance too, but they need adaptation finance. The third aspect is on domestic mobilization, but quite frankly, I think SIDS have proven that they have been domestically mobilized in finance to address their coping needs. And then on the private sector aspect, I mean, we know the narrative very well for SIDS. We're not an investment case, not singularly. There could be other ways of configuring how SIDS can become an investment case, but singularly, no. And when it comes to adaptation, no. So where are the other opportunities? One, I think it's important to recognize that there's a continuing discussion about actually establishing an adaptation finance goal. So this is just to go to your adaptation finance issue. And that needs to be articulated. It's possible that it's occurring in the context of the global goal and adaptation discussions, but it might very well be pulled out. And maybe something to think about in the climate change negotiation process is where are some of the decisions to be taken, and are there any new decision like cover decisions or things of that nature where issues that might not necessarily find their way into the process through the roadmap can find their way into the process through another mechanism. I don't know if I'm getting to what you wanted me to respond to, but I'm just thinking of the challenges to addressing the adaptation component in the Baku to Belam roadmap, other opportunities for addressing it in existing contexts, and new potential opportunities to address that in other areas. For mitigation, I think there are going to be challenges to addressing some of these issues in the context of the mitigation work program, just because it's always had a deadlock on getting anything substantive. It's mostly procedural, but maybe Anne has a different view on that, and she could certainly advise on that one. I do want to address one thing though, and that's just transition. It's a big issue for the larger developing countries, and the way things are shaping up, one of the big topic issues at the COP30 will be the Just Transition Work Program. And one of the countries that advocate strongly for just transition finance is the COP30 host. Can I say these things in this meeting? Is this
Yes.
closed? Okay, it's a closed meeting. Okay,
No, Janine, this is and I think it's good that region the PSIDS should know what's going on
Okay.
as well.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, so I think there could be a heavy bias towards this new type of finance, which is largely being defined by those bigger countries who have lots of investments in an energy area that they will need to transition from. And our host is one of them. It's a big topic. In your consideration of other, and forgive me, I'm going to use this, but this is like blasphemy in the AOSIS discussions to call markets a climate finance tool, but you will hear it. There's a new type of credit out there that's being considered in the context of carbon markets, and it's called just transition credits. And what will that mean for finance for our country? So I think there's some, this is not necessarily a finance COP, it's an implementation COP, it's a whatever COP you want to call it. But these are issues that potentially take up the oxygen out of the finance that we would want to see going to SPREP. And I think it needs to be contemplated in how SPREP then approach the agenda for COP30, including in relation to climate finance. I think there are some questions in their chat, but I'm not sure if I can read very well.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And maybe while we're looking at the questions, Anne, you wanted to contribute to the discussion? And Mark, I'll come back to you as well. Thank you, Anne.
No, I think Ambassador Janine has alluded to a lot of the contentious issues regarding the discussions and the negotiation. As I think she gave a really good presentation on the NCQG, the aspirational goal and the mobilization goal. So I think that distinction is there. She also, there are some innovative climate finance streams, such as the carbon markets, which has created a lot of interesting discussions within the AOSIS members. Given that the COP30 host is very much on rainforest and carbon markets, it is not a surprise to have them push this. But as this is a discussion where we try to unpack some of these issues, and it helps us understand also as the Alliance of Small Island States are working in strategizing, making sure that these other areas, and as Ambassador Janine has referred to as well on the just transition discussion that will be highlighted at COP30, will not overshadow AOSIS' call on ambition. And that is the highest political ambition on NDCs and aligned NDCs 1.5, which reads your question, Fred, on the finance targets, the finance goals, and how the trajectory reaches has us reached towards 1.5. So it's a big discussion between developing and developed countries, particularly developing countries, referring to the historical emitters have not reached, have not successfully come to the table as leaders on this. This is impacted also with the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement. Therefore, we look at other countries, particularly developing higher emitters or G20, to lead the discussion. So I think it all comes together, but it also realizes that the small island developing states are always fighting an uphill battle. So I think that's something. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, Janine.
Can I just come back in because I want to so we have to get in early. Oh, SPREPs have to get in early on that Baku to Belém roadmap, and I think on the finance minister circle, Fiji is still on that minister circle.
I've been told Fiji, Barbados, and now Marshall Islands has been invited, but we've not heard any from the three finance ministers. So they're the Ministry of Finance ministers. So we will try to reach out to them as well. Yeah.
So I think you need to use all
Yes.
avenues. So there's that finance ministers, and if you know the Brazil bureaucracy, they're very protocol heavy.
Yes.
They only talk to people of their own ranks, so you need to plan accordingly. So ambassador to ambassador, minister to minister, and nothing else. And they're taking this from the ministerial perspective. So just to give you a sense of, what needs to be done. So that's really important to get in there. I'm sure AOSIS, I'm pretty sure Tibian is working on a submission for September 10th, or he may have already sent that and I haven't been able to see it. I wanted to add two more things because Anne just mentioned about the focus that the COP30 presidency has on forests, and they have launched this tropical forest facility, which is about ecosystem services payment. I think backed by the World Bank. I don't know how much detail there is now about it. It was originally launched in Dubai, but it's a big thing for them now for COP30, and I'm not quite sure what kind of announcement. But what about oceans? And so I want to go to the global climate agenda, another entry point. So you entry point from the ministers, another entry point to bring a SPREP perspective to this COP30, which could be a way to also generate the discussion around SPREP circumstances, is the ocean. SPREPs have some 30% of global ocean within their territorial jurisdiction. That is not insignificant when you think of the ocean covering 2/3 of the planet. So I think that's really something that SPREPs might want to think about, and maybe it's going to be individual championing of that through the global climate agenda. But let's use every avenue that's open, go through it. And then the other question, other issue I think that will be interesting is the ICJ opinion. Now, the ICJ opinion is an opinion, yes, but there are some factors that make it complicated for SPREPs and some factors that make it useful for SPREPs. So when it comes to the climate finance component, and it probably should be a line that's used wherever possible, the opinion actually suggests that climate finance is an obligation, not a best effort provision. It's an obligation, and sufficient climate finance is an obligation. So that's an important thing. The complicating factor is this. So the opinion says that the COP decisions, any decision that's taken by the Conference of the Parties, influences the legal interpretation of the Framework Convention or the Paris Agreement or climate change obligations in general, which means there is going to be very, very close negotiation of language. And I can imagine that this will make climate finance discussions a whole lot more difficult. Or even when we talk about the 1.5, which the ICJ opinion says is the scientific consensus. It's not it's something that should be driving all action. I think we'll get to a very tense discussion. I'm not sure if the US will be there. They did show up at plastics and it became all the more difficult. But I think SPREPs will have to be prepared to understand how to deploy or utilize some of what came out of the opinion if they want to. It may make sense to. They would also need to be prepared for how to treat with decisions. You don't want to get anything below the bar of where we are right now with Paris. There's some aspects of that NCQG decision that is worrisome, or that are worrisome. You want to make sure that the language is precise. You maintain what we have already, and if there's more that can be produced or introduced, then that should be there. Political narrative will be key. So the interventions, whether at the heads or in the ministerial, I think there should be some echoing of clear messaging on 1.5, and also on the sufficiency of finance being an obligation, not an effort. Thanks.
Thank you, Janine, and I think that's really a good way of rounding up our webinar as well. But just before we go, Mark, you are still online, so I know that you did a very good. There's a lot of interest on your presentation, and Mark, just reflecting on pathways towards 1.5, and I think Janine and Anne has just provided very good discussions around where the agenda item on finance is heading, but where the entry points on advocacy for the special circumstance of SPREP as well. Maybe some final reflections from you, and then we'll wrap up the webinar. Thank you, Professor Mark.
Thanks, Fred. I think the sort of messages that I've heard from the other speakers is this is going to be challenging, both in terms of the mitigation agenda and progressing that in the face of political challenges, but also in the adaptation agenda because of those complicating factors that Janine was just talking about. And so my take on this is the science is increasingly clear that there's pathways which we collectively need to travel, and the politics is lagging well behind those. And so the pressure needs to keep on being pushed back into the legal system and back into the political systems, that what is happening is not consistent with the best assessments of the science and the economics of action on climate change.
Thank you very much, Professor Mark. I think with that, we will now wrap up our webinar. I have noticed that we've kept everybody interested until the end. All the participants stayed until end, so we want to appreciate our speakers. Before I hand it over to Offer to say a word of thanks to our speakers, I wanted to really reflect on the need for more engagement at different forums. I think like Mark says, the political engagement needs to match what the science is telling us. And I think, Janine, you've provided a great overview on where the NCQG discussions and the Baku to Bela roadmap will be, informing a lot of the discussions. We're having the PSIDS pre-COP deep dive sessions coming up, and the pre-COP coming as well, in preparing for COP 30. So these discussions are really, really informative and provides a lot of context going forward for the Pacific countries, but also for those who are joining us outside the region. So I will hand it over to Offer, the manager of the PCC, just to say a few words of thanks to our speakers, and then we will close the webinar. Thank you, Offer.
Thank you so much, Fred. Firstly, I'd like to echo Ambassador Veterinary message on the chat. What a privilege to have all our distinguished speakers online with us. Let me thank you, Your Excellency Janine, joining us from New York. Our Professor Mark Howden, who has been our key partner in the context of delivering the IPCC report to our Pacific. Ms. Anne Rasmussen, our very own Pacific negotiator, but also to our youth leadership and leader, Ms. Isabel. Thank you so much. I think there's a great deal of information, but also a great deal of experience and leadership through this webinar. And we want to thank you for taking the time and accepting our invitation to participate in today's webinar. We also would like to acknowledge all our participants who are joining us today. This is not our last webinar. We have a great deal of webinars coming up. And I think this is a really good start to the rest of the webinars, building on to COP 30, but also beyond that. And this is one of the key functions and services of why the Pacific Climate Change Center hosted here at SPREP was actually entrusted and established to deliver for our Pacific countries and our partners. It's really through capacity building, knowledge and information, but also innovation and science to services. So thank you all very much on behalf of the Director General SPREP, the Director of the Climate Change Resilience Program, and your team here at your service from the Pacific Climate Change Center. Malo.
Thank you.